Okay. Let's see. Looks like we are recording. That's good because we'll be starting here in just a minute. And everything else looks good. I'm a little gun shy because I had trouble with recording about 2 or 3 webinars ago, but looks like things are working. I hope you're having a good week so far. It feels like spring has actually struck us. iCADVA is very, very, very warm. We have no control over our temperature in this office, and it was already 80 by about 8 o'clock this morning. And so I anticipate it being 90, could easily get up to 100. It certainly has been there before, perhaps by the end of the week. Oh, always a little bit of excitement. I see people continuing to pop in. Welcome. Good to see folks. I assume you can hear me. I tend to just natter on for a while so people can make sure that their audio is actually working. You are, of course, welcome to make comments or put questions in the chat, or to push the little button to raise your hand if you want to have your audio turned on and say something to everybody. However you want to do it. I'm a little hungry, so I might talk fast so I can get to my lunch. Okay, well, I have noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. This will be recorded. It's being recorded. It will be up on our YouTube channel, and there are a couple handouts that you should be getting, including the actual PowerPoint itself. And I like to remind folks, when you're looking at, I'm saying the actual PowerPoint and not a PDF of the slides. When you look at the PowerPoint, if you slide up that little note section, you'll have all kinds of information in there as well, instead of just the bullet points that tend to be on a slide. So just FYI, if you are curious. Probably the first thing that we need to start with as we're having this conversation is simply about that term ally. And I do understand that there's a lot of questions, concerns, issues, uncertainties around the use of the word ally. And what does that mean? Do I get to call myself an ally? Am I an aspiring ally? Are allies what is needed, or is what is needed is an accomplice? I am, for good or bad, going to set some of that aside for the purposes of this webinar. Usually an ally is somebody who is considered to be a person of one social identity who stands up in support of members of another group. And of course, usually that it's a person usually of a dominant power identity standing up for somebody who is experiencing some social injustice. It is more than simply believing that inequality is a bad thing. It's more than having sympathy for groups that are being treated unjustly. So for our purposes, we're going to use a pretty simple definition, and that is that it is somebody who not only thinks that those injustices are a problem, but also somebody who thinks of themselves as taking some kind of action to combat it. Okay? I don't know how many of you remember your Schoolhouse Rock, but when you think the word ally rather than a noun, I really think it has to be a verb. It has to be about taking action If you want to go back to the original Latin, go back to the original Latin, the word ally comes from the idea of binding. So you're combining, you're united with another person for mutual benefit. And I think that's important, that it is always to all of our benefits to work together towards social justice. Along with this, I think there's the idea that it's not enough to be non-racist or non-homophobic or non-fill in the blank, but they must actually be actively anti-fill in the blank. Okay, checking on my stuff. So I'm going to put a quote in here from Roxane Gay. This is something that she wrote in an article, I believe right after Philando Castile was killed. And that is, Black people do not need allies. We need people to stand up and take on the problems born of oppression as their own, without remove or distance. We need people to do this even if they cannot fully understand what it's like to be oppressed for their race or ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, class, religion, or other marker of identity. We need people to use common sense to figure out how to participate in social justice. This honestly pretty much sums up a lot of what I'm going to say. I will keep touching back on this. One of the things I want to pull out of there is many of the materials I've drawn from do focus on issues of ethnicity and race, but that doesn't mean that these same principles don't apply to all kinds of other allyships. Another thing is the fact that people often feel overwhelmed and say, well, I just don't know what to do. And really it is common sense. We just need to remind ourselves. So we're going to pull out some common sense here about what allyship looks like. So to start with, the idea of figuring out what kind of ally you are, I'm pulling directly from the work of Dr. David Camp and his White Ally Toolkit. So you'll actually be hearing a lot for the next couple, this year and the next couple years probably, about the White Ally Toolkit, and I hope that we will be getting them for your programs this summer, so you can have a chance to work on them. There's tons of activities, ideas, and stuff that you can use within your program. And as I said, this focuses on race issues, but it can apply to any kind of allyship. And it's the idea of using active listening and storytelling to help bridge that gap between yourself and somebody who is what Dr. Camp calls a racism skeptic. His definition of white ally is somebody who thinks that racism is a special problem and who thinks of themselves as sometimes taking specific action to combat it, and a racism skeptic as somebody who thinks that racism against people of color is no worse than racism against whites, and don't think that society has any particular need or obligation to address it because it's just not a big deal. So some very kind of baseline definitions. And one of the places he starts is figuring out kind of how do I respond when I'm in a situation where I am suddenly find myself with a race skeptic, a racism skeptic, and how do I respond? Both how do I respond internally and how do I respond externally? And he's come up with some categories of kind of where people are at, and those are the allies that I want to talk about as a start in terms of what kind are you. And so one of the first folks that he talks about are what he calls the cavalry, or those first responders. They may not know what to do, but they are full speed ahead and they act. They can sometimes be really highly triggered emotionally. Like something happens, somebody says something, they see something, and boom, they are right there with intense emotional reaction. It's almost always apparent to everybody that they are intensely emotionally responding to this, and they pretty consistently always engage. They put out a lot of energy and hard work. The other part of this, though, is sometimes they're not terribly effective because it's kind of a, I'm going to throw everything against the wall and see what it sticks. They're not terribly strategic in the way that they approach. They do always approach. They are always in there, charging full speed ahead, but not necessarily thoughtfully and in a way that might prove effective. In their minds, the most important thing to do when they bump up against people denying racism is to immediately counter it, and they do so every time, but not always in a way that is reflective or sometimes useful. So in terms of what might be helpful, if that kind of, I'm that kind of an ally, is to first of all back off and say, okay, when I hear things and I get this emotional reaction, it sometimes makes it hard for me to stop and think strategically. So what is it that is particularly getting to me? Was there ever a time when it didn't get to me and I was able to kind of control where I was at and think through how I wanted to respond? Are there situations that are related, that are like highly emotional but not related to racism, where I have found ways to manage my emotions, and can I kind of pull that over and use those techniques? And what kind of strategies do work? What can I learn about what strategies work to connect with somebody who is a racism skeptic, or who is homophobic, or who is, you name it, anti-immigrant? How can I connect with them to be able to engage in a conversation that might bring them one or two steps closer to where we need them to be, that might open their perspective so that they can see that perhaps the world is not quite as black and white as they thought, that there are grays, and then not only are there grays, but maybe they don't know everything, and there's other viewpoints on this. One of the things to think about as we go through these is there may be some issues, depending on what your identity is, there might be some issues where you fall into one category of an ally on this particular issue, but on a different issue, you're like, oh, you know what? I'm not there. I actually respond more like that kind of ally with this other issue. Because we're all very complex beings. Another category of ally that he talks about are what he calls the reservists, and these are very contextual people. They have some understanding of where racism skeptics are coming from. They might have kind of an internal emotional response that's triggered, but they're not always, it doesn't necessarily get to them. Like, they're more able to control it. They are more likely to stay centered. They're more likely to, even though they think that person is wrong, they're still more likely to have an empathetic understanding of how they got to that position, why they think those things. There's a lot of factors that come in terms of both their internal reaction and their behavior, including their mood that day, that particular relationship. In other words, their internal reaction and then their response to it is very highly dependent on what's happening. So they're not terribly consistent with their reactions. And again, kind of not necessarily confident that what they do on those times when they do engage, whether or not it's going to be positive and produce the kind of results that they're looking for. So for those people they're very contextual, is this getting to me today? Is it not getting to me today? Is it worth my time here? Is it not worth my time? Am I going to engage? Am I not? For those, the suggestions are focusing on, okay, so there are times when you see the issue and you can see it clearly and rationally, and you can respond. What are those contexts that makes you able to do that? And then what are the times when you're not able to do that? What's different? And how can you hook into both whatever internal stuff? Maybe you have good self-talk the times when you're not triggered. Can you hook into that, specifically point it out and hook into that self-talk so that you can move yourself to engage in a more productive way? What are those times when you have engaged and you have felt like you came away from that counter with that person thinking, okay, maybe she has a point. What worked about that communication strategy? So these folks, there's a lot of kind of strategic self-reflection evaluation that they can do to become better allies. Another group he calls the analysts, and these are really quiet observers. They care about racial justice, other social justice issues, but are kind of confused about what their proper role is or what the proper response should be. Not sure, okay, is it really my place to address this with this person? Tend to have a more subdued response both internally and externally, often just stay on the sidelines as observers. And it's like, well, I know this is bad. I know it bothers me. I don't know what to do about it. I don't know if it's my job to do something about it. I'm just gonna watch and learn. And there, the primary focus in terms of a growth edge, if you will, is to go from inaction to action, to make a decision that, you know what, I can take all of these things that I've learned and I've observed and use them to actually engage with somebody, to take that risk. I need to think about what holds me back from doing that. What am I afraid of? Am I afraid of being triggered internally when right now I'm not? If it becomes too personal, am I afraid of harming a relationship? Do I not feel safe in a particular context to say anything? So those are kind of the leading edge of questions to ask and to push on for that kind of allyship to take a step closer to doing productive engagement and taking action. There's two more kinds of allies that he outlines. One of them he calls the scouts, and those are folks that absolutely can see it but are very distant from engaging. Different kinds of bigoted statements really bug them. They don't understand where people are coming from when they think and say those things. They may get very angry or sad internally, but they are very cautious. They don't have a plan. They don't want to hurt a moment or a relationship, and so they choose not to engage. They may just shake their heads and sigh, usually inside, because they really, if the analyst was at least thinking about what they were observing, the scouts are hesitant to even sometimes go that far. And partly that's because they're afraid that if they engage poorly, that they may make the situation worse, and so they're very much disengaged. They're watching from a much farther distance. For those folks, again, what is the internal thought process that happens as far as what their fears are? When have there been times when they've engaged on a highly emotional topic and it has gone well? And what were the strategies they used that make it go well? One of the things to think about is even if you engage in a conversation with somebody who is a racism skeptic or any of a number of other issues. Not only is one of those goals, oh, I might bring them along, not I might change their mind, but I might make room for them to question their realities, that maybe there's a little bit more space for some other realities. But also, do I have the ability, can it be a testing ground for me to have the ability to ask a non-judgmental question? Can it be a testing ground for me to have the ability to try and to bridge an empathy gap with somebody else? Doesn't mean I have to agree with their point of view. Doesn't mean that I have to think that they are right about their facts, their figures, their opinion, but can I see how it was that they came to that place? And can I ask good, juicy questions? So it's a testing ground for my skills, to develop my skills on them. Can I ask good, juicy questions that will allow them to think without getting defensive? So that's kind of the leading edge for Scouts. And people who are really skilled at doing that, those are the folks that he calls the undercover spies. So these are undercover spies. They are Zen activists. They are able to control that internal reaction and respond very strategically. They have a keen understanding of where those perspectives are coming from. They get it. They may not agree with it, but they have some understanding and some empathy of how somebody ended up in that place to be expressing those views. And because they can say, okay, that's a human being that had these things, and I get that piece, they can stay calm, not reactive. They can respect people whose thoughts they find deeply troubling, and they can engage them and make strategic choices to guide a conversation that would invite them to think differently without making them feel judged. That's a huge task and a huge ask, and boy, I wish that I had the skills to be an undercover spy, to be that kind of a Zen activist. I don't think I do, but it certainly is something that I would aspire to. And for these folks, as far as a growth edge, sometimes it's hard because, again, you're not going to go in and have a conversation with somebody and, wow, they have done a 360 and changed their mind. So sometimes it's really hard to know if that engagement is actually working. Did they go away from that and think about what was said? And one of the ways to know that is, do they come back to the discussion later? Did they feel respected enough to come back and engage with you again because you made them curious, because they didn't feel like you were dismissing them, because they felt respected, and so you are somebody that they are willing to talk about that heated issue one more time with. So it can be easy to overestimate your impact if you are a undercover spy. One growth edge you can have is to make sure you're going back to those conversations. Another growth edge you can have actually is to spend some time and energy helping other folks who struggle with this to become better allies. Figure out, is there any way that you can improve the depth of your effectiveness when you use stories, when you ask good questions? Can you find better questions that can help get to the heart of the matter? Are there risks that you're not taking when you're engaging with people? And why not? So there's still growth, if you will. There are still things you can do to improve. I guess it would be impressive too. If you are an undercover spy who is able to be in a room full of people with an opposing point of view and keep your calm and open up space and engage in a productive way that doesn't cause defensiveness. So that's one one schema, if you will, of types of allies. Another thing to think about is, okay, what kind of things do allies do? And so I took up this kind of schema, which is, okay, different allies hopefully do all of these things, but there are, depending on what issue and kind of where your allyship is, you might be in one position or another that you're focusing on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about self-reflection, engaging, interrupting, and learning. And these are actual real things that I hope that we are busy doing. One of them, of course, is learning. The information is absolutely out there. Some questions you can ask yourself about your allyship, like, how did I get this far in my life? Like, so how did I get into my 50s and not know that X, Y, and Z? Not know the history of housing and urban development. And that doesn't mean I need to know what this administration, what year it was started and which policies, whatever. But to have a general idea of how over the course of the last couple decades has that affected the lives of people in poverty. And how is it that I didn't know that? Well, I don't know it because I've never had to. I grew up middle class. I'm a middle class woman now. So I don't have to know it because I have privilege. But the information is there. I just have to take the time to find it. How about, if you're in kind of a supervisory position, how did I get this far without knowing about implicit bias and how our practices might have a differing impact on different employees, different volunteers, even though it would seem neutral? How did I get to this point where I've never had to question that? And nobody has helped me to question that. How did I get this far without knowing how to respond when a coworker or a client or a peer in another agency says or does something that's problematic, that is racist, that is anti-immigrant, that is anti-battered women? There's a lot of us who are really good allies when it comes to our clients, whether that's domestic violence or sexual assault or human trafficking, you name it, that we feel comfortable being allies there. But when it comes to other identities for our clients, or even for ourselves, where we founder and we don't know what to do, and how is that? And one thing I would say is, the information is out there. You don't need free tutoring. You don't need to ask somebody and expect for them one-on-one to teach you the information that you are missing. There are plenty of insights. There are plenty of books. It's not like it's hard to reach across identities and get the information. People have been trying. If you are a member of a dominant identity, people have been trying to give you this information and tell you what their experience is like since the dawn of time, pretty much. And so it's right there waiting just for you to pick it up. Part of that learning can be hard if you are, again, in a dominant group. And so I'm going to pull out some information. This is from Robin DiAngelo and her book, White Fragility, which I would recommend to anybody. And she talks about accepting feedback and some of the barriers that people put in place to hearing feedback and to accepting it. And so these are some pretty common rules or feelings or behaviors and things that white people will put forward as a reason why, or a shield against hearing feedback about whiteness and about something that they, implicit or explicit, may have done. And so you'll hear people talk about, well, if the problem is that they're not saying it in a nice way. The problem is that she was so angry with me that I didn't feel safe, I didn't feel comfortable, and so I don't have to listen to that or respond to that because it just makes me feel unsafe. This is something that actually particularly bothers me within our movement, is that we will often use the word safe because it's kind of a trigger word amongst each other as a way of saying I didn't feel comfortable. And it's a shutdown for the conversation. It doesn't open up conversation, it shuts it down. It pretty much silences anything after that when we pull out the I didn't feel safe card. So proper tone is crucial, is a rule that white folks often put forward as a way of not having to accept whatever is being said to them. Similarly, the idea that, well, I don't know why that person didn't say it immediately. If they were really uncomfortable, if that was such a bad thing, they should have said something immediately. And the fact that they didn't say anything for days, weeks, months, years means that it's illegitimate and I don't have to pay attention to it. Again, within our movement, we don't accept that when it's about the issue of sexual assault, for example, but it is an excuse that is often put forward when it is about our own responses and actions. If we're working from a dominant culture perspective and we've done something that is harmful, and of course, it needs to be private is about I don't want to be outed in front of people, and that made me feel uncomfortable. So I didn't have, again, the forum wasn't correct for me to receive that feedback, and therefore the feedback is illegitimate. There's a lot of argument over intention versus impact. So, well, I didn't mean to, I meant to just be curious. I didn't mean to be offensive. I didn't mean to. And so until you acknowledge that I am a good person, I don't have to hear anything else you have to say. And until you acknowledge the fact that this was unintentional, I don't have to, I'm somehow, and once you do it, acknowledge that it was unintentional, I'm somehow no longer responsible for the impact of what happened. Another thing is getting stuck on, again, because this is about white fragility, getting stuck on where I do have privilege and saying that, well, because I am a white woman, saying that if you are confronting me on my white privilege, you're saying that I've never experienced any oppression as a woman. And a zillion and one ways of saying that phrase, which again shuts down the conversation. It allows me to say, oh, but I've been oppressed in this other way. Therefore, I understand everything about your experience. Therefore, I can't possibly be being biased in any way. And that is a tactic that's used constantly, too, to not have to accept feedback. Common feelings are, well, I feel like I'm being judged. Well, I'm not going to say anything because every time I say anything, it's wrong, and so I'm just going to be silent. I'm feeling ashamed, and therefore my feelings are so uncomfortable. I don't have to accept your feedback. I don't have to engage with you. Lots of other ways of trying to shut down the conversation and the feedback, the crying, the withdrawing. And then there are some common claims. You don't need to tell me this because I already know it. I was marching back in the 60s kind of thing. So I already know everything about this issue. Or, well, you can't speak for everybody, and I've done this particular thing forever and it's never bothered anybody before, so you're just being too sensitive. The I've suffered too kind of goes back to, oh, you're invalidating me as a woman because you are confronting me about my racism. And the you don't know me, you're stereotyping kind of goes back to the good intentions. If you knew me, you would know that I would never say anything that was ableist. You would know that I would never say anything that was anti-trans. You knew me, but so I'm suddenly not responsible for something that I did. There's a great analogy around this that Presley Pizzo put together around that's called boots and sandals, and I just kind of want to pass it along because I think that we make a bigger deal out of knowing how to respond when we get feedback than we actually need to. And so it's imagine that privilege is a boot, like you're wearing these big heavy boots, and big heavy boots, at least like my big heavy snow boots, I'm not terribly graceful with them, and I can't necessarily feel everything like I could if I had bare feet, right? So imagine that you have big heavy boots. You didn't ask to have the boots, right? They were just given to you when you were born, and those are your shoes. You have boots, and the boots are privilege, right? And sometimes when you are stepping on somebody's feet, maybe they're barefoot, maybe they're wearing sandals, etc., you don't even know because the wonderful privilege gift that you were given at birth is big heavy boots. And so then if somebody says, ouch, you're stepping on my toes, then how do you react? A lot of people, hopefully, are not going to react by, first of all, centering themselves and going, centering themselves would be, I just can't believe you think I'm stepping on your toes. I'm a good person. I would never step on anybody's toes, kind of making it about you. Denying that other people's experiences are different would be something like, well, I don't mind when people step on my toes, which is ridiculous, and yet you hear people say those kinds of things. People will derail, and they'll do kind of the whataboutism. Well, some people don't even have toes. Why aren't we talking about them instead? There's refusal to center the person that's impacted, and that would be the all toes matter. Well, my toes matter, even though I have a boot. My toes matter. That person's toes over there in the sneakers, theirs matters too. So it doesn't matter that I'm standing on your toes right now, that I did something that hurt you. Tone policing is the, well, I would move my foot if you would ask me more nicely, but because you're yelling at me for standing on your toes, I don't have to hear that kind of feedback. Denying that the problem is fixable sometimes. Well, toes getting stepped on is a fact of life. You just have to accept that. And if you didn't want your toes to be stepped on, I guess you ought to move your feet or you ought to get some decent shoes, which also slides into victim blaming. Well, if you hadn't been walking around without boots, or if you didn't walk around people that have boots, then your toes would never have been stepped on, so it's your fault. Sometimes people will withdraw. Well, I thought you wanted my help, but all you are doing is complaining about my boots, so I guess not. I guess I'll just go home. In reality, all of us know how to react when we step on somebody's toes. We say, we center the person that's impacted. Oh, excuse me, are you okay? We listen to their response. We learn from them. We apologize for the impact. Even though we didn't intend to step on their toes, we say, I'm sorry. And of course, we stop what we're doing. We actually move our feet and don't stand on their toes anymore. So it's really not that hard. You stop the pattern and you be careful where you step in the future. Maybe you are even able to do some systems work and change the kind of footwear, right? Sneakers for all, or get some boots that are a little less heavy and so you can see where you're going better. So reacting in a fair and helpful way when you're being called out is not that hard. But it does take managing your own emotions. And it can start with thanks for letting me know. Like, thanks. And even just that process of training yourself to stop and say, thanks for letting me know, can move you to a point where you're then going to stop the next things that come out of your mouth that are defensive or are argumentative or are about centering yourself and your own reactions. So again, from Robin DiAngelo, here's her rules for getting feedback. How, where, and when you give me feedback is irrelevant. It's the feedback that I want and need. Understanding it's hard to give, I will take it in any way I can get it. From my position of social, cultural, and institutional white power and privilege, I'm perfectly safe and I can handle it. If I cannot handle it, it's on me to build my racial stamina. And then rule number 2 is simply thank you. So again, read the book. All of that is that part of allyship and what kind of ally you are, kind of in the learning. And learning is about accepting feedback, and learning is about sometimes learning some hard things. There's another part of this, of that 4-part allyship is about engagement. And one thing I would say is people that you can influence the most are the people that are in your sphere the most. So your family, your friends, your coworkers. I think we often focus in our work on big picture systems change and changing our social structure and changing the nation. And actually, it is easier for you as an individual to change within your personal relationships and change within your sphere. And if you think about it from that bottom up layer, you have more control. If you changed 2 people and they changed 2 people and they changed 2 people and they changed 2 people, that's actually that kind of organic way is how change happens. So one of the things we need to do is we need to engage with our communities. And by that, I mean Thanksgiving dinner with your family. I mean white folks talking to white folks. I mean cisgendered straight people talking to other cisgendered straight people. And people who have privilege along all kinds of identities talking to other people that have those same privileges. Because for one thing, it's not fair if somebody doesn't have privilege. It's not fair for them to not only deal with not having a privilege, but also to do the heavy lifting of trying to do the social change at the same time. So if you have some kind of identity privilege, you also have an ethical responsibility to do the lifting. And so to engage with people that are like you, engage with your community to have conversations. And then I also think that then you expand your idea of, okay, I'm dealing with my community, but who is actually my community? And when I think of us, who am I excluding? Because beloved community means all of us. So, one of the biggest examples I can think of along this line is, once again, in the last couple of weeks, it has become very apparent to me that most Americans don't know that Puerto Rico is part of America and that Puerto Ricans are Americans. So you keep including our president. You keep seeing things about aiding Puerto Rico takes aid away from our farmers and from the states. It's like, no, that is us. So who is our community? I think is a really important question. When I say the word us in my head, who am I excluding? Who is invisible to me according to my privilege? Is it the homeless population in my community, right? Like, I live in Ames. Do I know where the homeless people are in Ames? Do I know where folks with disabilities are in my, am I thinking of the Latinas in my community when I think of us and who is my community? So part of engaging is not only focusing on people who share your identity privileges, but also expanding your idea of who is us. When I say us, when I say my family is all of us. One of the sections of that 4-point thing of allyship and ally actions, ally being a verb, is interrupting. And so there's kind of 2 levels you can interrupt, the micro and the macro level. I'm not going to go into this too much because I did a whole webinar, and there's lots of information out there on strategies about interrupting microaggressions, and I'm also sending out a handout that is specifically about strategies for interrupting. One of my sister's best things that she does to interrupt is she just says, "Oh, ouch," and that's kind of her opening point to then have a conversation, and I love that, and she is so brave. She has said, "Oh, ouch" to me. She has said, "Oh, ouch" to her supervisor. It's just, "Oh, ouch." And then you see people go, oh, and then that kind of stops, and then there's a conversation. She's very skilled. The picture that's up on your screen right now is actually from a lovely video that's called "What Kind of Asian Are You?" that I would recommend to folks. And it's two joggers, and the white dude comes up and they have a conversation, and he wants to know what kind of Asian are you? And she turns the tables on him. It's a great video, using humor to interrupt what is a microaggression or macroaggression, if you will. There's also a follow-up I would recommend, which is them reading feedback that they got about this video once it was out there. And that is also very instructive in how people respond to being called out. Another part of interrupting is on a larger level. Again, there's many opportunities and places that where you can interrupt on a larger level. I want to raise up, highlight whatever the website beautifultrouble.org, because it has all kinds of concepts for getting people to engage in beautiful trouble, in causing social awareness, in causing a little bit of discomfort, if you will, in raising issues and concerns in a way that gets people engaged. And one of the things that's great about their website, you know what? While I'm saying this, let's see if we can't just go to it. Let's just pull it up right now. Oops, wrong thing. Next time you're thinking, oh, we're having a rally, it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, what are we going to do? This would be a great site because you can explore visually. They have everything divided up according to theories, principles, and tactics. So here we can look at different tactics. And click on one. And here's a tactic you can use. Here's a tactic you can use. Here's a tactic you can use. There's all kinds of them. They have case studies over here in green of different kinds of social actions. Case studies: mining the museum, flash mobs. They have principles of social actions. So how to make it the most effective possible. Balance art in the message. Know your cultural terrain. Consider your audience. And all of these things you can explore further by clicking through, right? Show, don't tell. Make the invisible visible. So tactics, principles, theories about social action. The idea that nonviolence is an important revolutionary theory for us, where you can apply leverage to change things, analyzing power, you name it. And then over here are examples of practitioners, which again will give you some more case studies. So it's a great website in terms of kind of a larger level as opposed to the micro level. And I wanted to highlight that for you. It is also just a fun, beautiful website to explore. Where are we at? So beautifultrouble.org. Finally, here's my little note. You are the kind of ally you want to be. So what kind of ally are you? You are the kind of ally you want to be. There are all kinds of ways to be an ally. Just yesterday morning, there was a counter-protest to Westboro Baptist Church in Ames. And while I went to the rally myself, a counter-protest, if you will, not rally, one of my daughters was like, I really want to participate, but I don't feel like I can go to it. And like, great, not a problem. Let's figure out a way for you to participate. So she and I sat and made rainbow-colored ribbon wands that people could wave at passing drivers and whatever. And so her way of participating was to help me create that. Like she could have, if I had taken posters, she could have made signs, even if she wasn't there present herself to hold the signs. So people are the allies that they want to be, that they take the effort to be. There's all kinds of ways to participate. And the place where you have the control to apply leverage is right there in the relationships you have right now, every day, with the folks that you have the power to influence most. So, as I said, you'll be getting the PowerPoint. You will be getting some handouts. You'll be getting this guide to being a straight ally. Again, great information that can be applied along all kinds of different intersections of identity. I loved this ally spectrum here that they had, and the idea that you can be an ally along different parts of the spectrum. I'm starting to get it. I really said it. I'm focusing my time on learning. I'm talking about it. Let's go change some laws. That there's place on the spectrum for all of us in all of our journeys. So you'll be getting that guide too. And I hope you had a good lunch. Any comments as I've rattled on? You'll be getting that. Okay, I'm not seeing any comments, any chats, any raised hands. So I will thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you on the next round. I don't even know what the next one is, but maybe I will see you in person soon, or at least we will meet on the next webinar.